When Phyllis Diller walked onto a stage, the room erupted before she even opened her mouth. With her wild, straw-like wigs standing on end, her oversized dresses clashing like a joke in themselves, and that cackling laugh that could rattle through walls, she seemed larger than life. To millions, she was the queen of comedy, the outrageous woman who fearlessly roasted her own looks and made her husband Fang the eternal punchline. But the woman who made a career out of making fun of herself was hiding more than anyone could imagine. For more than 30 years, every week without fail, Phyllis drove to the same place, carrying a private devotion she never revealed to audiences. Inside those walls was someone she loved more than anyone, someone whose life circumstances she couldn't talk about in interviews, on stage, or in her books. It was the one part of her life she protected fiercely, even as everything else about her became a punchline. Those visits came to an end in 1993, and when they stopped, her heartbreak was so deep, it reshaped the rest of her life. To understand why Phyllis Diller never stopped working, even after her health gave out, and even after her own heart literally failed her, you have to look past the cackle, past the wigs and jokes, into the story of a girl from Lima, Ohio, who built her life out of equal parts tragedy and laughter. Phyllis Ada Driver was born on July 17, 1917, in Lima, Ohio, during the final years of World War I. Her childhood was unusual from the start, beginning with her parents. Her father, Perry, was already 55 when she was born, and her mother, Frances, was 36. At a time when most children grew up with young, bustling parents, Phyllis was raised in a household dominated by age. Relatives were older, visitors were older, and family gatherings often revolved around sickness and funerals. Most children would have been frightened of death, avoiding cemeteries or shrinking back at the mention of it. But Phyllis was different. Death fascinated her. She wasn't afraid of it. She absorbed the way people mourned, the way people joked even in the darkest moments, and how families carried on despite endless loss. That early exposure gave her an unusual comfort with subjects most people avoided, something that would become one of her comedic trademarks years later. Her family's roots traced back to Germany and Ireland, and they raised her Methodist. But Phyllis rejected religion early. She never found solace in churches or sermons. Instead, she discovered the power of humor. By the time she reached Central High School, she was known as the class clown, cracking jokes in the hallways and lifting spirits when classmates least expected it. But laughter wasn't enough to shield her family from what came next. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the Driver household, like millions across America, was gutted financially. Once stable, they suddenly found themselves struggling to make ends meet. Phyllis was still just a teenager, but she quickly learned how to hustle. She sold newspapers on the street to bring in what little money she could, helping her family scrape by. Every coin she earned toughened her, hardening the resilience she would later rely on when life tested her in far crueler ways. But inside her quiet home, where conversations often lingered on money, illness, or death, Phyllis turned inward. She invented stories to keep herself entertained, and before long, those stories took the shape of jokes. Comedy became her secret outlet, though at the time she had no idea it would become her career. By the time she was 10, her real passion was music. Phyllis was gifted at the piano, and her talent was impossible to ignore. In 1927, she earned a place at the Sherwood Music Conservatory in Chicago, an honor reserved for the most talented young musicians. She was a prodigy, and by her early 20s, she was already performing with orchestras. For many families, this would have been the golden ticket, a daughter destined to become a concert pianist. But Phyllis was plagued by doubt. Surrounded by brilliant teachers, she convinced herself she could never be as good as they were. And so she quit. She walked away from music not because she lacked talent, but because she believed she would never measure up. Years later, she admitted it was one of the hardest decisions of her life. Still, it may have been fate. Leaving music closed one door, but it opened another, one that would eventually lead her to comedy. The Depression didn't make things easy. In 1933, her family's finances collapsed entirely, and she had to leave the conservatory after just 3 years. To survive, she took whatever job she could, pushing herself into the working world long before she was ready. Later, she tried to return to education, enrolling at Bluffton College in 1935 to study music education. For 2 years, she worked toward a degree, but in 1937, she left again, this time for marriage. She was just 20 when she married Sherwood Anderson Diller. For the next 2 decades, that marriage would define her life, often painfully, shaping the stories that later became comedy gold. The early years of marriage were tough. In 1940, the couple moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan, where Sherwood worked at a bomber plant. Life was frugal, with the country rationing supplies during wartime. That same year, Phyllis gave birth to her first child, Peter. She was just 23, and while she loved her son, the strain of motherhood in such difficult times pushed her into postpartum depression. There was no name for it back then, no language to explain the overwhelming sadness she felt. Instead, she bottled it up and carried on. Between 1940 and 1945, the family moved at least 8 times, chasing work and trying to survive. They eventually settled in California, where Sherwood found a job at the Alameda Naval Air Station. But the financial stress never eased. At home, Phyllis held everything together, often retreating into the comfort of radio shows. While she cooked, cleaned, and cared for her children, she listened to the quick wit of comedians on air. Those voices planted a seed. They reminded her that humor could be an escape, a survival tool. Her second child, Sally, was born in 1944, and with Sherwood often unemployed, Phyllis stepped in as the breadwinner. She took a job as a newspaper editor, learning skills that would later give her an edge in writing her own material. But tragedy struck in 1945 when she gave birth to a baby boy. Some reports say his name was Perry. Others say he died before being named. He lived for just 2 weeks. The loss shattered her. Doctors blamed prematurity and the limited medical technology of the time, but that explanation brought no comfort. Phyllis was just 28, grieving deeply, yet still forced to keep her household running while her husband drifted between jobs. Performing in local theater productions in San Francisco gave her a place to hide her grief. On stage, she could escape herself, but the pain wasn't done with her. Soon after, she suffered a miscarriage. Over the years, she would endure 6 pregnancies, with 5 children surviving. Each birth brought joy, but also more weight on her already overburdened shoulders. Between 1946 and 1950, she gave birth to Suzanne, Stephanie, and another son, also named Perry. That brought the number of surviving children to 5. But the larger the family grew, the less money they had. Sherwood developed a reputation for rejecting jobs he felt were beneath him, and at one point he squandered a $10,000 inheritance that could have stabilized their lives. Instead, the family ended up relying on food stamps, scraping together meals with powdered milk and cheap groceries. Phyllis did everything she could, writing short articles for just $2 each, bringing in $15 to $20 a week at most. She had 5 children under 10, no child care, and very little support. Years later, she would spin those struggles into jokes, stories about lazy husbands, disastrous kitchens, and the chaos of raising children. But at the time, it didn't feel funny. It felt like drowning. By 1952, things hit rock bottom. The family was evicted from their home for failing to pay $300 in rent. That same year, Phyllis got her first real break, though it didn't look glamorous. She found steady work as a radio copywriter at a station in Oakland, making $75 a week. It wasn't much, but it was the first reliable paycheck she'd ever had. While there, she created a short segment called Phyllis Diller, the homely friend maker, where she poked fun at housewife advice. It was silly, it was fun, and more importantly, it gave her a voice. Encouraged by Sherwood, who believed she had a natural talent for performance, she tried her hand at live comedy. Her first attempt was at a veterans hospital, where she bombed miserably. Heckled by patients while she played piano, she walked off humiliated. But she didn't quit. If anything, the sting of failure pushed her harder. She had survived worse, after all. Then everything changed. On March 7, 1955, at the age of 37, Phyllis Diller stepped onto the stage at San Francisco's Purple Onion. It was the moment that would transform her life. Unlike glamorous female performers of the time, Phyllis didn't try to look pretty or polished. Instead, she leaned into her awkwardness. She made fun of her own looks, her disastrous cooking, her life as a frazzled mother. She joked that her food could kill a man, and the audience couldn't stop laughing. It was raw, it was different, and it worked. What was supposed to be a short gig turned into an 89-week run, nearly 2 years. The Purple Onion raked in more than $100,000 from her shows, and suddenly this exhausted mother of 5 was being taken seriously as a comic. She was still making just $100 a week herself, but the exposure led to television appearances and a career she could finally call her own. She credited her courage to a book she had read called The Magic of Believing, which inspired her to finally chase what she wanted. After 15 years of homemaking, she had found her purpose. By 1956, Phyllis reinvented herself completely. She created a stage persona so unforgettable that no one else could touch it. She wore a wild horsehair wig, painted her face with exaggerated makeup, carried a long cigarette holder she barely used, and dressed in clashing clothes that made her look outrageous. While other women in show business tried to be beautiful, Phyllis made herself as ugly as possible, and owned it. The gamble worked. Bookings soared by 40% almost overnight. Audiences loved her because she wasn't pretending to be perfect. She was the opposite. She was the joke, and she turned that joke into power. But to truly understand the strange circumstances of Hulk Hogan's final years, we need to go back to the very beginning, before the fame, before the scandals, before the million-dollar mansions. Hogan wasn't born a larger-than-life figure. He was just Terry Bollea, a shy kid from Augusta, Georgia, who grew up in Tampa, Florida. As a boy, he was fascinated with baseball and music. In fact, before he ever set foot in a wrestling ring, he dreamed of being a rock star. He played bass guitar in a local band, performing in smoky bars and small clubs long before the world knew his name. Friends from those days recall him as quiet, almost soft-spoken. Nothing like the roaring, muscle-bound hero he would later become. But beneath that quiet exterior, there was always a hunger for recognition, for respect, and for something bigger than the life he was living. That hunger would eventually push him toward the squared circle, where destiny would change everything. It wasn't an easy climb. Hogan first tried his hand at professional wrestling in the late 1970s, training under the legendary Hiro Matsuda, who was known for breaking down his students to see if they had the grit to survive. Hogan certainly did. He endured broken bones, grueling workouts, and constant rejection before finally getting booked on small wrestling shows across the South. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, but Hogan never quit. He was captivated by the larger-than-life characters he saw in the ring, men who could command thousands of fans with a single gesture. And when promoters noticed his towering frame, over 6'7" and packed with muscle, they realized they had something special. By the early 1980s, Hogan had transformed himself into exactly what the wrestling world was missing, the perfect hero for a generation that craved simple, powerful symbols of good triumphing over evil. When Vince McMahon brought him to the World Wrestling Federation, everything changed. Almost overnight, Hulk Hogan became a household name. With his ripped yellow and red gear, his handlebar mustache, and his booming catchphrases, he wasn't just a wrestler, he was a cultural icon. Kids adored him, parents respected him, and even people who never watched wrestling knew who Hulk Hogan was. He told fans to train hard, say their prayers, and take their vitamins. He was the ultimate American hero, battling cartoonish villains in the ring while selling out arenas across the country. Wrestling had always been popular, but Hogan took it to a level no one thought possible. He wasn't just part of the show, he was the show. Every pay-per-view, every action figure, every magazine cover, it was Hogan's face that sold it. At his peak, he was making millions and living a lifestyle that seemed untouchable. But fame like that never comes without a price, and for Hogan, that price was higher than most could ever imagine. Behind the scenes, the pressures of being the Hulkster were enormous. The constant travel, the physical punishment of wrestling, and the relentless demands of fans and promoters began to wear him down. To keep up his superhuman image, Hogan turned to performance enhancers, something that would later haunt him when steroid scandals rocked the wrestling world. He also struggled with injuries that never fully healed, forcing him to wrestle through pain that would have sidelined most men. But Hogan kept going because stepping away wasn't an option. His entire identity was tied to being Hulk Hogan, and without that, who was he? That question lingered in the shadows for years, unspoken but always present, as Hogan tried to balance the man he truly was with the legend the world demanded he be. The cracks began to show in the 1990s, when public opinion started shifting. The wrestling boom of the 1980s gave way to darker, edgier storylines, and Hogan's squeaky clean image began to feel outdated. He reinvented himself as Hollywood Hogan, turning heel in WCW and shocking fans who had once cheered him. The move revitalized his career, but it also revealed something deeper. Hogan was no longer content to play the one-dimensional hero. He wanted to embrace the darker sides of his persona, perhaps because those sides had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. And while this new version of Hogan kept him relevant, it also blurred the line between the character and the man, making it harder and harder to know where Terry Bollea ended and Hulk Hogan began. By the 2000s, the golden era was long gone, but Hogan was still chasing the spotlight. Reality TV shows, endorsements, appearances, he never fully stepped away. Yet as the years went on, controversy followed him everywhere. The collapse of his marriage, the bitter family disputes, and the infamous leaked recordings that tarnished his image all took their toll. For the first time, the public began to turn on him. The man who had once been the embodiment of strength and virtue was now being painted as flawed, troubled, even hypocritical. And though he tried to rebuild his reputation, the damage was done. Hogan had gone from hero to scandal figure in the eyes of many, and that transformation weighed heavily on him in his final years. When friends spoke about Hogan during that period, they described a man who was nostalgic, reflective, and often lonely. The crowds were smaller, the cheers less deafening, and the world had moved on to newer stars. Hogan still lived in luxury, but those closest to him said he often retreated into silence when the cameras were gone. He had everything he once dreamed of, wealth, fame, and recognition, but there was a lingering sense that it had all come at too great a cost. And when the news broke of his death, those who knew him best couldn't help but wonder if the strain of living two lives, one as Terry Bollea, the man, and one as Hulk Hogan, the legend, had finally caught up with him. The announcement of Hulk Hogan's death was presented to the public as natural, almost ordinary, heart complications, the kind that might be expected for a man in his 70s who had lived through decades of physical punishment. Yet the moment the headlines hit, something didn't sit right. Fans, journalists, even former colleagues began to ask questions. How could the man who once seemed indestructible, who had survived scandals, lawsuits, betrayals, and countless injuries, suddenly be gone without warning? And why did the official statements feel so carefully worded, as if they were leaving something out? Almost immediately, whispers of a cover-up began spreading. And the more people dug into Hogan's final days, the stranger the story became. In the weeks leading up to his death, Hogan had reportedly become more reclusive than ever. Friends who visited him in Florida described him as guarded, almost paranoid. He was still physically imposing, though clearly slowed by age and lingering injuries, but it wasn't just his body that showed the wear, it was his mind. Hogan had begun speaking about enemies from his past, people he believed had never forgiven him for things that happened decades ago. Some brushed it off as the ramblings of a man haunted by regrets, but others felt he was genuinely fearful. There were stories of him changing his phone numbers frequently, refusing to trust even old friends, and even hiring additional private security despite living in a gated mansion. All of this painted the picture of a man who felt hunted, even if the threat wasn't visible. Adding fuel to the mystery were Hogan's finances. Despite earning hundreds of millions throughout his career, legal battles, divorces, and lawsuits had drained much of his fortune. Reports indicated that he was locked in disputes over intellectual property, including who truly owned the rights to the Hulk Hogan name and brand. Some claimed he had been in negotiations with major companies, trying to sell or license his legacy in a deal worth tens of millions. If true, Hogan was sitting on a gold mine, one that others might have been very interested in controlling. The timing of his death, right as these rumored deals were reaching their peak, struck many as more than coincidence. Then there was the matter of Hogan's health records. Official reports said natural causes, but insiders who had access to his medical files painted a more complicated picture. Hogan had undergone multiple back surgeries, hip replacements, and other invasive procedures in the years prior. He was on pain medication, some of it strong enough to be dangerous if combined incorrectly. Sources hinted that Hogan had been warned repeatedly about the risks of mixing certain prescriptions, yet he often ignored the advice. Was his death simply the tragic result of years of wear and tear, coupled with careless reliance on medication? Or was there more to it? Something deliberately covered up to protect his image, or perhaps to protect others who had a stake in the Hogan brand? The day of his passing itself raises more questions than answers. According to initial statements, Hogan was found alone in his Florida mansion, discovered by staff in the late morning after he failed to answer calls. But those who knew his routines found that odd. Hogan was rarely alone. He often had friends, assistants, or family visiting, and he had developed a habit of waking early and calling his inner circle almost daily. For him to vanish into silence until someone stumbled upon his body didn't align with what people expected. Even stranger, the mansion was said to have multiple security cameras, yet reports about reviewing the footage were inconsistent. Some sources claimed the footage from the night before was missing or unavailable, while others insisted authorities had seen it but refused to release details. Why would simple home security footage become a matter of secrecy unless there was something on it the public wasn't meant to see? Adding to the uncertainty were Hogan's final social media posts. Just days before his death, he had written cryptic messages that fans initially dismissed as motivational ramblings. Phrases like, "The truth will come out," and "You never know who's really in your corner," took on new meaning once the news broke. Some interpreted them as Hogan addressing private family disputes, while others saw them as hints that he knew something was about to happen. One particular post, a photo of him in his gym with the caption, "Still standing, no matter what they throw at me," was widely shared after his death, with fans wondering if it was his way of signaling that he was under pressure from forces outside his control. The people closest to him gave conflicting accounts. Some insisted Hogan had been in good spirits, making plans for new projects, even discussing another autobiography where he wanted to finally tell everything. If true, that book might have revealed long-buried secrets about wrestling's darkest chapters, including organized crime connections, drug scandals, and backstage betrayals. Others said Hogan had seemed tired, worn down, and ready to retreat from the spotlight permanently. It's difficult to know which version was true. Or if both were, because Hogan was always a performer, and even in his private life, he knew how to put on a mask when it suited him. What we do know is that Hogan's death didn't close the book on his story. If anything, it opened a new chapter, one filled with rumors, investigations, and a lingering sense that the full truth has not yet been revealed. Was his passing truly natural, the inevitable end for a man who had pushed his body beyond its limits? Or was it the final act of a life lived under the constant shadow of power, money, and enemies who never went away? The more you look at the inconsistencies, the harder it becomes to accept the simple version of events. And for fans who grew up believing in the indestructible hero of Hulkamania, that uncertainty is perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation of all. As the shock waves of Hulk Hogan's death rippled across the world, what began as simple grief turned into something far more complicated. News outlets were quick to celebrate his larger-than-life persona, his wrestling championships, his role in shaping modern sports entertainment, his appearances in movies and television. But beneath the glowing tributes were cracks that couldn't be ignored. Fans began piecing together stories that didn't align, and suddenly, the line between hero and human was more blurred than ever. Hogan had built his life on a mix of truth and performance, and in death, that performance seemed to follow him. One of the loudest voices questioning the official story was none other than people from within the wrestling world. Several retired wrestlers, men who had shared locker rooms with Hogan for decades, openly hinted that something was being kept from the public. They recalled how Hogan had confided in them during the last few years about people coming after him, not physically, but financially and legally. Old rivals, business partners, even corporations were circling his brand like vultures. Hogan's name wasn't just a man, it was intellectual property worth millions. For those who stood to gain, his passing left behind